months earlier in London at the General Assembly, debarring Franco's Spain from being involved with UN activities. Therefore, we should not collaborate with them on drug control, and we should not invite fascist Spain to be a party to this new protocol that we're discussing. And despite the near unanimous opinion of the General Assembly, we have the parallel universes cropping up. We have the government of the United Kingdom arguing very strenuously against this, that we have to work with Franco when it comes to questions of drug control. Even though Republican Democrats are languishing in prisons in fascist Spain, if you use some of the debates from the General Assembly, we still have to work with Franco around drugs because we can't have Spain become a narco state. I mean, some of the language is very similar to modern language. My home country, Canada, also opposed this resolution. In the end, the resolution that the UN should not collaborate with Franco's Spain on drug control did pass. The UK was the only government that voted against it. 5 countries abstained, including Canada and Greece and France and Colombia, one other, I can't remember. But again, we get back to Professor Hunt's comments that we have governments in one body of the UN talking about human rights that speak in a certain language, and as soon as they move over and get into the forum talking about drugs, they talk a very different language. And I say this dates from the very foundation of the institution itself. So we move to the modern day, the United Nations drug control system. This is the United Nations headquarters in Vienna. Many of you may not know that there's a UN headquarters in Vienna. People are familiar with the one in New York, where the General Assembly with. You'd be familiar with the one in Geneva, where the human rights bodies sit, the World Health Organization sits. This is the one in Vienna, which is where the drug control regime sits, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency. In addition to the International Narcotics Control Board, which I mentioned, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is based in Vienna, which many of you have probably heard of, and also the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. The international drug control regime is underpinned in the modern era by 3 international conventions negotiated through the United Nations system. These conventions enjoy almost universal ratification at this point in time. The first one was agreed in 1961, and this was essentially the convention that brought together all of the existing League of Nations conventions under that, primarily dealing with plant-based narcotics, focusing primarily on cannabis, coca, and opium. The 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, again, extending international control to more, laboratory-based drugs. And the 1988 Convention, which expands and further codifies penal sanctions related to drug control. As I mentioned, the International Narcotics Control Board, which oversees these 3 treaties as the treaty body. We also have the political body, which is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which meets in Vienna. I guess 52, 53 member states. This is the old room that they used to meet in. I like this picture. That person there, that's actually me speaking. You'll see the seat I'm sitting in is actually the designated NGO seat at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. We get 1 seat, and it's very near the door. Actually, if you move two seats to my right, you're actually basically in the toilets. So that's where the NGOs sit. And I like this picture because you'll notice if you're actually important in this meeting, you sit up there because that's actually where everyone's facing. So you have your little NGOs, and we share seats if we get the opportunity to speak, which isn't very often, to make a representation to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Within the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they have a separate meeting, which is called the Committee of the Whole, which is essentially where they negotiate line by line the resolutions that come before the committee. And this is a separate room. And in 2008, it was an interesting time, and Damon was part of this. A very leading member of the UK delegation at that point in time, where the very first human rights resolution ever proposed came for debate before the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it caused all kinds of controversy. Not to pick on the Chinese delegation, but they had some of the best lines. Again, to talk about these parallel universes or this disconnect, China argued that discussion of political issues such as human rights are inappropriate at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. It's not appropriate to address human rights within the mission of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and it's ridiculous to require us to work in accordance with human rights law. That's China there. And that's Damon. You can't really see him arguing against China. The resolution passed in a watered-down form. It was actually quite significant, even though the language itself was weakened. When we go to the language of the convention itself, I think we can see where some of this disconnect continues even within the legal instruments. This is from the preamble to the 1961 convention. And we see that the primary objective of the treaty supposedly is to be concerned with the health and welfare of mankind, and talks about the need to provide narcotic drugs for pain relief and for scientific and medical purposes. And for those of us who do human rights, I think we can be very comfortable with this kind of language. This is very much falls within the conception of the right to the highest attainable standard of health. The general comment on Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights talks specifically about one of the obligations within Article 12, the right to health, is the provision of medicines, for example. So I think for human rights people like ourselves, this is something we can be very comfortable with, this kind of conception of drug control. But of course, this more humanitarian instinct is sort of immediately undercut by the subsequent lines in the preamble, which talks about addiction to narcotic drugs constituting a serious evil for the individual and being fraught with significant danger to mankind, and it's the responsibility of states to combat this evil. And I remember when I was doing research on this, I was really perplexed because the term evil isn't something you really see in legal instruments. You know, we talk about evil, that's like a philosophical concept or a theological concept that we talk about. You don't really talk about evil within legal terms. So it got me thinking about other international instruments that were drafted to control or suppress or prohibit other kinds of behaviors or social institutions or social or political systems which the international community finds abhorrent. So, for example, the Convention Against Slavery in 1926 doesn't describe slavery as evil. The Genocide Convention doesn't describe genocide as evil. The Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't describe nuclear holocaust as evil. The Apartheid Convention doesn't describe apartheid as evil, and the Torture Convention doesn't describe torture as evil. Yet somehow drug addiction within international law is evil, an evil that must be combated through universal coordinated action amongst states. The language, as we get past 1961, gets even a bit more, dramatic. This is from the Political Declaration on Drugs in 1988. Drugs are a grave threat to the health and well-being of all mankind, the independence of states, democracy, the stability of nations, the structure of all societies, and the dignity and hope of millions of people and their families. And this is very much the kind of language you see today in instruments around terrorism. And I think there is a parallel when we're talking about human rights protections in one war, the war on drugs versus the war on terror. I think there's a lot of work that is available to be done by people doing human rights to look at some of the parallels in the approach to those. And I guess just to close off then, we have to start thinking in human rights terms is what are actually the human rights consequences of defining drugs and drug addiction as an evil that needs to be combated through coordinated universal action. And just to touch on a few very quickly, there's many. The death penalty is one that we've already mentioned earlier on. I say Ricky would know this sign much better than us. The death penalty for drug offenses. I say the issue that the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion on. Well, the UN human rights system has very strong opinions on this. The Human Rights Committee has said explicitly that drug crimes do not meet the threshold of most serious crimes under Article 6.2 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime has in this point in time spoken out against the death penalty for drugs, the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Quite unanimous opinion amongst the United Nations generally on the death penalty and specifically the death penalty for drugs. Despite that, about 32 countries and territories have the death penalty for drugs in legislation, and we estimate that perhaps up to 1,000 people a year are executed for drug offenses. So it's actually, in terms of overall executions internationally, drug offenses represent a significant number of people who are executed. Arbitrary detention, the other issue I mentioned at the beginning. In quite a number of countries, particularly in Asia and South Asia, we have forms of arbitrary detention, detention without trial, administrative detention, under the guise of drug treatment. And these are, people can be detained for months or even up to years at a time in conditions which have been very well documented now in many countries, amount to forced labor, if not inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment, beatings, overcrowded prison conditions, lack of access to medical treatment, humiliating treatment, caning. About 350,000 people in arbitrary detention of this kind in China, in drug detention, say Vietnam, Thailand, India, Russia, some other countries. Ironically, the very week that Hamid Godzi said that the International Narcotics Control Board didn't have a position on this, 12 UN agencies came out collectively with a statement condemning drug detention. Sort of a fairly unprecedented statement by 12 separate agencies of the UN, yet the International Narcotics Control Board doesn't have an opinion. Again, related not only to drug detention centers, but something our colleague Eka Yakobashvili, alumni here of the Essex Human Rights Center, has done sort of the leading work on, is the issue of corporal punishment for drug offenses, which we see in at least a dozen countries that we've documented it in: caning, flogging, whipping for drug use or relapsing from drug addiction or from drug treatment. Again, very clearly a form of inhuman and degrading punishment, which is fairly universally condemned by human rights monitors. And just very quickly, again, it's already been mentioned, the right to health. We have about 15 million people that we know inject drugs worldwide, a very major behavior in the spread of HIV epidemics in many parts of the world. Yet in many parts of the world, people are denied the access to the prevention of, or access to measures to prevent HIV, such as sterile injecting equipment, such as methadone programs, very much putting those people at additional and preventable risk of HIV infection and increased overdose in many countries as well. That's something we can talk about more specifically, and something that Professor Hunt did quite a lot of work on during his time as special rapporteur. And so I opened with two people, one you recognize and one you didn't, probably the same here. You probably, although reversed, you probably recognize the person on your left, the Pope. The person on your right you probably don't recognize. That's Yuri Fedotov, the newish head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, a career Russian diplomat, former Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom, who is unfortunately bringing a very reactionary tenor to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime at the moment, particularly when it comes to rights of health issues of people who use drugs. Also when it comes to issues that Noam mentioned of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime's position on Afghanistan. Of course, Russia is very much fighting with Afghanistan in the international arena because Russia blames its drug problems on Afghanistan. And just a nice quote from Tvetan Todorov, the philosopher, talking about the context of delivering us from evil. The idea that it implies that there is an evil element in human nature from which God can free us, and we'll pray that he'll free us as beings. And we know human beings have sometimes been tempted to take upon this purifying role ourselves, and we're very well aware of the catastrophic consequences. So thank you very much.
Of the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy, also Deputy Director at Harm Reduction International. He's very well known internationally for his work on the human rights dimensions of drug policies as researcher, advocate, thinker. And he's the author of the first commentary on Article 33 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the only core UN human rights treaty to refer to drugs. And this is going to be the subject of his talk. Thanks very much, Damon.
Thanks very much, Paul. I promised this wasn't planned, but I'm pretty much going to follow almost exactly Rick's trajectory in his talk, and I'm going to drill it down into the rights of the child, if possible, except without evil. I'm talking about something a little bit more positive. I'm asking the question about appropriate measures for quite a good reason, and I think you'll see it. We've been doing seminars, myself and Rick, at universities for the last few years as part of this project, and The first one we did was in Galway at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, and myself and Rick were sitting in a hotel, and we wondered how we were going to do it. And we realised the best way to do it is just ask the audience to name any human right, any single human right you like, and we'll be able to connect it to drug policy pretty quickly. One particular smart arse said, well, the right to not be imprisoned for non-payment of a debt. And I was like, that's just not fair. You can't prove us wrong. But what I can do, what it showed was two things. The first is that drug policy is sweeping, but the second is that the human rights framework is more than up to the challenge. Now, the thing is, over time I've realized that you can name any child right, and I can connect it to drug policy in the same way. Now, part of that is because the Convention on the Rights of the Child is quite comprehensive, and the other is because the impacts of drug control and drug policies and drug use and dependence on children is so sweeping. And I'm going to try and deal with some of that now. So, this picture follows a raid on a favela in Brazil in 2009. I think it was on a day when 19 people were killed. And the first time I looked at it, the reason I looked at it was about where your eye is drawn, and it's drawn to the bloody mess to the centre left. What you miss is the blurry child in the front foreground, I think often, which is looking directly at you, almost asking to be noticed. And I found that across the board, really, in drug control and in children's rights, the issue of children and drugs coming together hasn't necessarily been noticed. You got the Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1959, talking about mankind owing to the child the best it has to give. And in drug control, similar rhetoric comes through. What you often find is that, and this happens at the UN level, you've got the Political Declaration on Drugs there from 2009. That was the 10-year review, by the way, of the declaration Rick mentioned, talking about children as our future and youth as our most precious asset. Therefore, what we do is in their name, as well as democracies and the well-being of our entire society and all the rest of the stuff that Rick mentioned. You see this at national level too, and you see it to justify some pretty unusual things. I might talk about that a little later, but children are at the foreground of justifications for drug control. And I think that's right. I can't think of a better justification. But the question is whether what's actually been done delivers on that promise or not, or if it's been positive or negative for children's rights and well-being. Coming in the middle of those two declarations that I mentioned, of course, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, smack in the middle was the first time drugs appeared in the negotiations, and it was introduced by China. It looks very different now. This is the actual wording from what it did then. At the time, it was about preventing and prohibiting children from using drugs, but the Netherlands quite, I think, helpfully pointed out that this is a children's rights convention, and talking about prevention, preventing things or prohibitions within it, it doesn't fit. So a more of a protection approach was taken. It's a 50-word article, right? So and it's, read on its own, if you take a rather literal approach to that, it's not going to tell you much at all. It simply says that you take all appropriate measures to protect children from drugs and don't let them get used in the drug trade either, which is singularly unhelpful, in fact, except that it brings those parallel universes we talked about straight together, at least for children and young people within this convention. So the question of what it means, I think, is quite important, because children's rights have not really been much of a subject in drugs when it comes to drug policies. Article 33 in the academia, if you search for it, doesn't really appear, and if it does, my name's probably now next to it, sadly. And there's a couple of notable articles, but not many. In the UN drug control regime, it pops up every so often, but it's rare and it's usually unhelpful. It will either be equating it with prevention, so education in schools and just stopping children using drugs, which is part of it but not the entirety. It doesn't lead you anywhere. There are resolutions at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs on Children, and they will frame everything around Article 33, but then they just talk about what we call primary prevention. And at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, you've got some very helpful recommendations. You've got general comment on HIV/AIDS, which has some very good normative guidance in it. You've got the general comment on adolescent health, which is good. You've got some concluding observations that are excellent, particularly in more recent years. I would invite anybody to read the one on Ukraine from 2011. Then you've got some that are very general and quite vague. They just restate Article 33 and move on. And then you've got some that are really quite unhelpful. They tend to talk about combating drug addiction the same way as the Drug Convention does. And a particular example where, at the time, I think it was 2002, the Philippines were asked to enforce their drug control legislation in order to protect children, which was a real example of the committee's ignorance of the context, because at the time the Philippines had the death penalty for drugs. They've now abolished it for all crimes, but at the time that's what the Committee on the Rights of the Child was telling the Philippines to do in the name of children's rights. In the actual conventions themselves, I think this is an example of the parallel universes too, and the reason to drill down. You've got these singular mentions. Drugs appears once in the core human rights treaties, happens to be the CRC. It does appear in the International Labour Organization Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labour, pops up in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, a kind of mixed up wording of Article 33 that makes it considerably worse, I think. And it comes up in some other regional documents. Human rights appears only once in those 3 drug conventions that Rick mentioned, which is unusual given that there's over 110 articles collectively. Given that they cover issues like extradition and penalties, it appears only once, and it's in the context of crop eradication in the 1988 Trafficking Convention. And then the interesting thing for me is I did a search for children and minors and youth and any such wording, and they similarly appear only once each. Children appears in the preamble to the 1988 Convention, in that the threat to children is a danger of, quote, incalculable gravity. And minors appear also in the same convention under the penal provisions, saying that if you use minors in trafficking or if you sell drugs near a sports or educational ground, these are the particularly serious crimes. So there's the official connections drawn. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are more connections, but it needs a lot more work that hasn't quite been done, which is what this book was about, I believe. Yeah, there we go. So I did this with my colleague, Philip Veerman, who's now a psychologist working with young people who use drugs in the Netherlands, but he formerly was at Defence for Children International, so he's got a good crossover there. And that Nancy has a copy of this book if anyone wants to read it. To buy it yourself, it's quite expensive, but there is one here in Nancy's office if anyone